Hi, I'm Marcia Lehman and I'm a Knox County Master Gardener. Today we're pruning a tree. Now this is a little different because so far everything we've done have been shrubs. What I'm standing next to is actually a sugar maple, but it's not all about sugar maples. We're actually talking about pruning trees that are referred to as bleeder trees, and sugar maple is probably the first bleeder tree that most people think of. But bleeder trees also include birch, beech, elm, willow, flowering plum, and flowering cherry. Now the term bleeder comes from the fact that when you cut them, they ooze a lot of sap. And while a lot of trees get pruned while dormant, you don't want to do that with a bleeder tree because, thinking back to the sugar maple, when do they make maple syrup? They collect that late winter, early spring, when the sap is starting to come up out of the roots and into the top of the tree. So you don't want to prune bleeder trees while they're dormant. You want to prune bleeder trees after they have leafed out and while the leaves are growing. They're active because that uses up the sap and they bleed less. They will still bleed, they will just bleed less. Then the important thing is to finish your pruning. So this is going to be summertime pruning, and a lot of folks say July 4th. You can go a little beyond that, but the real limit is finish your pruning of bleeder trees 8 to 10 weeks before your first frost. And in the Knoxville area, that first frost is generally the end of October. So if you back up 8 weeks, 2 months, that's the end of August. And if I add 2 more weeks, that's the middle of August. So we are kind of pushing it because we're well into the first week of August. So we have about a 1 week window left to prune bleeder trees. But you could be doing this in June and July and into mid-August. This tree was planted in the fall of 2021. When it was installed, it was probably 7 or 8 feet tall. It is now, we're estimating, about 14, 15 feet tall. So it has grown tremendously. One of the other attributes of sugar maple, and why we chose it as our exemplar for bleeder trees, sugar maples have a tendency to develop codominant leaders. And in any sizable tree, you want a single leader. And the time to fix those codominant leaders is when it is small. So we're going to pause for a moment. We'll pan up to the top so you can see how tall this is. And then we'll come in and we'll zoom in on where we have a codominant leader issue. So here we go, up towards the top. This is now 14 or 15 feet tall. And being that tall, you can't stand above it and look down on the structure. So what you can do is stand under it and look up into the structure. And I can't show you what I'm seeing, but I see multiple stems coming up in the middle, which are trying to be codominant leaders. And so we'll stop the camera, we'll focus specifically on the point where I'm going to make some cuts so that you can see those. A point of clarification, I mentioned sugar maples love to develop codominant leaders. That codominant leader is not specific to bleeder trees. You'll find it in oak trees and other hardwood trees. You'll rarely find it in an evergreen. So I think we've got a decent shot here where we come up and we've got a major branch, and then I've got all sorts of stuff wanting to grow here in the middle. First of all, it's rubbing, that's not good, but second, it's trying to compete. So I'm coming in here and I'm protecting the branch collar and not making a flush cut. It'll have just a little bit of a stub left, and we'll take that out. And then behind there, you can now see here, now this one definitely wants to be a codominant leader, because it's trying to grow straight up, and that needs to come out. And that one I'm going to take out in 2 pieces where I can get my loppers in up here and pull that out. and then I'll go in and make a cleanup cut here. And then what you probably can't see is there's what I would call a bad pruning cut that was made at the nursery. So clearly this maple demonstrated codominant leaders when it was still in the nursery, and they cleaned them up, not as well as I would like, but they removed it, but it also stimulated growth of this other codominant leader. So let me see now if I can get in here. Nope, I'll be up on a step stool. I'm going to make this cut off camera. So here's the cleanup cut that I made. I took that off a little higher just to give myself working room, and then I got up on a step stool to make this cleanup cut. And here is where there had been a pruning cut made in the nursery. And again, in pruning trees, you may hear the term coated. That stands for compartmentalized decay in trees. Anytime you make a cut, you will have some decay. And that's why we need to protect the branch collar, because that's the healing tissue that will wrap around and close that wound. So when I took this off, let me show you what the base of it looks like. This is indication of the compartmentalized decay that was resulting from the pruning cut that had been made in the nursery. So we've now cleaned that up, and I'm going to try and clean up the cut inside here a little better. But we have a couple more instances where cuts had been made in the nursery, and we need to clean that up. And then of course we have now opened up the center, and we'll do a little assessment of how much more we need to take off. But in a sizable tree like a sugar maple and these other bleeder trees, the branches should be at least 6 to 12 inches apart, and we've got some in here that are like 2 and 3 inches apart. Little spindly stuff, so we'll do a little thinning out on that. Doesn't have anything to do with the fact that it's a bleeder tree or codominant leader. It's just a good pruning practice when you get a tree from the nursery. Now, one of the other comments I would make is, often when you buy a young tree, you'll have little spindly branches growing off the base of the trunk. It's really tempting to clean them up, remove them, and in fact all the ones here were removed by the nursery, so you may not see them, but in fact for the first several years those are very helpful in helping the tree create a really strong trunk. They're called temporary branches, and they'll eventually fall off. They never get really big, but they help the trunk develop. So resist the temptation to take off those little temporary branches for the first 3 to 5 years. If they start to get big, like a ½ inch, then by all means take it off, because that's trying to become a competing branch. But as long as it stays small, it's a temporary branch, and in a couple of years it'll fall off. So on the trunk, let those stay. So we'll do a little assessment here. I'm going to clean up a couple of old nursery cuts, and then we'll come back and tell you what we're doing. We've taken off the 3 branches that were in here in the middle that we said we were going to take off, and it has really opened up this side of the tree. From the street side, the tree's not going to look any different, but it should be interesting to see now that those 3 competing things have been removed, how this fills out. So the next thing we're going to do, again, not just because it's a bleeder tree, but this is what you do with trees, is you find your lowest permanent branch, and in this case it happens to be on the back side, so you can't really see it, but it's right here where my arm is. And coming out right below it is a branch, so anything below the lowest permanent branch needs to come off. Then we're back into that spacing, and branches looking up should be 6 to 12 inches apart. This is still a young tree, so you could go a little close and give it a little trim each year. But I'm looking at things that want to grow out. And this is one, and it comes from way back here. So we'll take that off. And really spindly things, but especially that come up and they curl around and they go another direction. So the last thing, cleaning up some of those really misshapen branches and starting to address the issue of getting branches 6 to 12 inches apart. And you can do that over the course of several years, because as you can see, many of these lower branches, that one wants to hang directly down, many of these lower branches are less than 1/4 inch in diameter. So they need a little time to mature. You know, you just don't know what you're going to lose in a storm, so don't take everything off at one time. So that's how we attack this sugar maple. Again, we picked this example because sugar maple is probably the #1 tree that comes to mind when you mention bleeder trees. So this pruning video is about the timing of pruning bleeder trees, and then specifically in the case of sugar maple, addressing its tendency to develop codominant leaders. So I'll spend a little bit more time cleaning up some spindly stuff, looking at that 6 to 12 inch spacing. But I hope you learned something today, and we thank you so much for joining us.